All right, we're going to begin, and I will introduce myself again because now we're being joined via webcast, and I want to welcome all of you from near and far, including, I understand, a class from School Without Walls. Welcome. My name is Kathleen Keenes. I direct the Gender and Peacebuilding Center here at the United States Institute of Peace. We've just seen a very remarkable film, which was a part of a PBS special called Women, War, and Peace. 12 years ago, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1325. It is an important resolution for all of us to know about because it was meant to bring awareness about the impact of war on women's lives. That was part one of the resolution. Part two was really to recognize that women can and should be a significant player in peace building. Not only should peace for all not be determined by 50% of the population, but peace for all needs to be made by all of us. And so today we really have three experts sitting here who understand not only what war looks like on the ground, but what it looks like through the lens of how women see war. And so I invited each of them to spend time from their own particular perspective as an academic, practitioner, filmmaker, investigative reporter, to talk about how women go from being victims of war into empowered people. I've asked our first panelist today, Dr. Virginia Bouvier, who is here at the United States Institute of Peace and is really our senior expert on Latin America and is a well-known expert of Colombia, including being the lead editor of the book by the same name, Colombia. It's a real privilege to work with Jenny, and I've asked her here today to set the scene as to where we are today in Colombia in terms of women and peace building, and also to give us some retrospective. I will then introduce each of our panelists just before they speak. So without further delay, because we want to have lots of time to have a discussion, we have great panelists, but I know there are many experts right here in this audience. And so, Jenny, please help us set the scene today.
Thanks very much, Kathleen. And first, I'd just like to see, is the group from Havana here? I'd like to welcome, this group just came in from Florida for this event. They're going to be here in Washington with a number of activities, but these are some leaders, many of them Afro-Colombian. I'm not sure if you're all Afro-Colombian, but many leaders of development issues, of women's issues, of all sorts of grassroots projects that are quite fascinating and quite innovative, and I'm hoping that you'll share some of your own experiences in working for peace in your particular sector in the discussion period. I'd like to first just say how overwhelmed I am by that film before I go into my role as an academic. I think I'm the academic on the panel, so I'll try to do that. I'm so struck by the courage of these women, as Kathleen mentioned. I'm also struck by the youthfulness of the two women leaders that you chose to profile. And I think that represents a new generation of young people in Colombia in particular, but around the world in conflict zones that are saying, we're not going to stand for it anymore. We have to seek change. The incredible odds against these women. I think Jimena Sanchez underscored that at the end when she said, 80% chance that they would be assassinated, but with the international outreach and finding out about what's going on in the community, reducing that to 50%. Those are horrendous odds. They're horrendous odds. I was also struck by the respect with which these women are held by their communities. They are exercising a kind of leadership that is really quite phenomenal. And you get a sense of the capacity of the collective, the capacity of these communities when they join together to resist changes that impact their lives. I was also struck by what it means to be a mother in a conflict zone. And I think Clemencia spoke to that, the fact that she's been displaced 4 times, and that one scene where she doesn't know where her son is was very powerful. So with that kind of emotional, affective introduction, I'm going to turn to a little bit more of an academic presentation and try to step back and situate the film in a broader context of what's happening in the international level first of women, security, and peace, and then zero in on Colombia kind of at a national level, and then finally integrate what we've seen in the film at the more local level. A new development in the field of conflict prevention and resolution in the past 12 years has been the greater recognition of women's potential contributions to the field of international peace and security. The designation in 2011 of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, President of Liberia, Lema Gwobwi, an activist in Liberia, and Tawakkol Carmen of Yemen as joint Nobel Peace Prize winners in 2011 was an important collective acknowledgement of women's participation in peacebuilding work, and that recognition is new. The international community has been actively designing normative frameworks, and individual governments in collaboration with civil society have been creating national action plans that recognize and promote women's roles in peacemaking and peacebuilding, as well as conflict prevention. Beginning in 2000, as Kathleen has mentioned, and I think, how many of you are familiar with 1325 Security Council? I'll just say a few words, since it looks like some of you may not know. The UN Security Council passed numerous resolutions that recognize the differential impact of war on women and men, call for the inclusion of women in all aspects of conflict prevention and peace building, and recognize domestic violence and violence against women and girls as a threat to international peace. With Security Council resolutions 1325 and subsequent resolutions 1820, 1880, 1888, and 1889, 1960, and 1974, there have been, as you can see, a whole range of them over the last 12 years. Normative frameworks and international commitments are in place for increasing the participation of women in conflict prevention, monitoring and addressing sexual and gender-based violence in the context of armed conflict, and building institutional capacity. Just one sec, I'm going to turn this off. And building institutional capacity to curtail impunity and exact greater justice for victims of gender-based crimes. The UN Security Council resolutions mandate protection from and accountability for gender-based and sexual violence in conflict zones. They call for the integration of gender perspectives and analysis in conflict prevention initiatives, ceasefire agreements, peace accords, DDR, which are demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration strategies, reparations programs, and the design and implementation of post-conflict reconciliation initiatives. Despite these tremendous normative advances, the translation from discourse at the international level to practice at the national level has moved with glacial slowness. A recent status review noted persistent gaps in implementation of the Security Council resolutions and the continued low numbers of women in formal institutions of conflict prevention, especially in preventive diplomacy and mediation. Likewise, the United Nations itself has yet to appoint a woman as a lead mediator in any of its missions. Less than 10% of negotiators and less than 3% of those who sign peace agreements are women. Implementation of these resolutions has been slow or non-existent, but the pressure for results is steadily increasing. More importantly, the institutional structures for demanding accountability, are also being developed, particularly with UN reforms in 2010 that merged the resources and mandates of 4 UN agencies charged with working on gender equality and women's empowerment into a single powerhouse agency, the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, also known as UN Women. Now reporting with new reporting requirements that will allow progress toward the established benchmarks to be documented, the preparation as well as, and there's also in process, the preparation of a general resolution on women in conflict and post-conflict situations as part of the CEDAW review. That's the Anti-Discrimination Against Women Convention. Furthermore, there are national action plans to bring national governments into alignment with their international commitments on women, peace, and security. More than 40 countries have now issued national action plans. In the United States, with the executive order of President Obama last December 2011, instituting the U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, the U.S. institutionalized, quote, a gender-responsive approach in its diplomatic, development, and defense-related work in conflict-affected environments. The plan attests that the engagement and protection of women as agents of peace and stability will be central to the U.S.'s efforts to promote security, prevent, respond to, and resolve conflict, and rebuild societies. And it commits to improving women's leadership and substantive participation in peace processes, conflict prevention, peace building, transitional processes, and decision-making institutions in conflict-affected environments. The plan articulates priorities for government agencies to empower women in peace processes, protect girls and women from violence, and promote women's engagement in conflict prevention and equal access to relief and recovery. So how does all of this relate to Colombia, you might ask? And this is a very valid question. International norms requiring greater female engagement in all aspects of conflict prevention and resolution have been slow to be implemented in Latin America and the Caribbean, as in other parts of the world. I'd like to talk briefly about 3 aspects related to the gender dimensions of war and peace in Colombia. First, the impact of war on women, and we've seen that very visibly in the film today. Secondly, the multiple roles that women play in relation to conflict and peace in Colombia. And we see a multitude of ways that women are engaged, both in the quest for peace and in the war itself. And third, I'll say a few words about the role of gender in the conflict and in the building of sustainable peace. So first, the impact of war on women. War impacts all of Colombian society, albeit in different ways and different ways in different regions. Women, the rural population in general, and the rural poor in particular, youth, Afro-Colombians, and the indigenous, have a history of political, social, and economic exclusion in Colombia, and they are bearing the brunt of the armed conflict. About 1/3 of Colombia's displaced population is of African descent, more than half are women, and half are under the age of 15. At least 13% of Colombia's rural population is now displaced, and rural poverty in Colombia appears to be growing. The World Bank estimates that 80% of rural Colombians live in poverty, with 42% of them living in extreme poverty. Afro-Colombians, the largest minority group in the country, and indigenous communities, a smaller percentage, are at particular risk for poverty, displacement, environmental degradation, ill health, illiteracy, food insecurity, and violation of their basic human rights. Most of the 5 million Colombians who have been forcibly displaced are women, and most of those are Afro-Colombian or indigenous. Like men, human rights violations that affect women include arbitrary arrests and killings, forced disappearances, threats, as well as the violence of war itself, the landmines, the loss of lives, the loss of unborn children, loss of children more generally through recruitment as well as being killed, or loss of family members. Girls and women are particularly vulnerable to sexual and gender-based violence. Such violence, or the threat of such violence, is often the cause for the displacement of entire families. Some girls choose to join armed groups, at times seeking new roles beyond the options they're given in Colombian traditional society. Rates of participation of girls in illegal groups in Colombia varies by the group, with estimates of about 30 to 40% women and girls in the FARC. Some 10% of the paramilitary groups the paramilitaries who demobilized in group were women. In practice, those most affected by conflicts are usually those most disempowered within a country, including women, children, and youth, and ethnic minorities. They are also the ones less likely to be given a voice during peace negotiations and international mediation efforts. Consequently, their specific interests have generally not been well served by peace accords. Yet, as is so beautifully illustrated in the film we've just seen, it would be misleading to limit our discussion to the victimization of women. Women in Colombia have been active agents of both war and peace. In past peace processes in Colombia, of which there have been many, women have rarely had roles on the negotiating teams, although they made up some 28 to 31% of the M19 and 17.5% of the Corriente de Renovación Socialista, and they're said to constitute today some 30 to 40% of the FARC. In 1980, when the Dominican Republic embassy was taken over, the M19 named a woman, Carmenza Londoño, also known as La Chiqui, as a negotiator, in part because they didn't want the male leadership to risk being killed, but also to capitalize on the element of surprise at having a woman negotiator. In the 4 sets of peace talks between the Colombian government and the FARC in the course of the last 3 decades, no women have been the official negotiators for either side. At the peace tables in Caguan 10 years ago, 1 guerrilla woman and 1 female representative of civil society participated in thematic committees created by the negotiating teams to channel civil society inputs into the process. In the various dialogues with the ELN, another guerrilla group, women's participation has been similarly sparse, with a single woman invited to accompany exploratory talks in Havana, albeit not in a negotiating or mediation capacity. The talks in 2004 that led to the demobilization of the paramilitary AUC also included no women. Even within civil society, though, it has often been difficult for women to find room at the table when peace talks are underway. The Consejo Nacional de Paz, the National Peace Council, created in 1998 to channel civil society inputs into a peace process, has had a small minority of female representation. In the period when it was active during the last peace talks from 1998 to 2002, only 3 women participated in a council of a total of 66 members over that period of time. Now to today, or tomorrow, I should say. Tomorrow in Havana, Cuba, negotiators from the Colombian government and the FARC begin preparations for the next round of peace talks that are scheduled to resume there on November 15th. The launching of peace talks in Oslo and Havana between the Colombian government and the Colombian Revolutionary Armed Forces, FARC, in recent months has opened an opportunity for the Colombian government to put its international commitments regarding women, peace, and security into practice. So far, however, neither the government nor the FARC have included women among their lead negotiators. On the government side, 2 women, Lucia Jaramillo Ayerbe and Elena Ambrosi, signed the General Framework Agreement in Havana on August 26, 2012, as witnesses for the Colombian government team. They will be on the government team in Havana, representing the Colombian Ministry of Defense and the Office of the Presidency, though they will not be among the 5 official spokespersons with official decision-making authority. On the FARC side, Sandra Ramirez, the longtime companion of FARC founding father Manuel Marulanda, also participated in the secret talks that led to the signing of the General Framework Agreement, which she signed as Sandra Garcia. She was a late addition to the FARC team for Oslo and Havana, but similarly is not one of the lead negotiators. Likewise, the FARC has named Dutch FARC guerrilla Tanja Niemeyer to serve as a translator on the FARC's negotiating team, a role which officially reduces her to repeating what others tell her. There's little assurance that the few women who have been given minor roles setting the table or facilitating conversation, and the many women who will play major and largely unrecognized roles cleaning up afterwards, will have the space to speak or the power to be heard. The presence of 30 to 40% of a minority group is generally considered to be the critical mass necessary for change or impact. It is telling, too, that in the Colombian conflict, where political, social, and economic exclusion of one sort or another is often cited as the key root cause, the composition of the negotiating team reflects these very exclusions. There is, of course, no guarantee that particular women, or men for that matter, will address gender concerns. But women's participation in peace processes has often made a difference in the scope and sustainability of agreements that includes and goes beyond so-called women's issues. Many peace agreements that have ended wars around the world have not been sustainable, with about half of them ending in a resumption of conflict within a decade. The statistics are improving somewhat over time as we are learning that a peace deal that agrees to laying down weapons is insufficient if the broader root causes of the conflict are not addressed. The issue of inclusion turns out to be key to the sustainability of peace. Likewise, it is often pressure from women, victims, and other sectors of civil society that helps ensure that truth, justice, and reparations issues are addressed. If these sectors do not feel their interests are being represented in whatever deals are struck, the legitimacy of the agreements will be questioned, implementation will become impossible, and peace will not be sustainable. In Northern Ireland, when women were finally allowed to participate in the talks that led to the Good Friday Peace Accords in 1998, they succeeded in broadening the peace agenda to include the needs of victims of violence, political prisoners, and young people, as well as provisions for integrated education and housing. In Guatemala, women negotiators inserted protections for indigenous, labor, and women's rights, as well as guarantees for a balance of power between civilian and military authorities. Perhaps as telling as the impact of female participation in peace talks has been the consequences of women's absence from the table. Their absence has meant, in particular, a lack of attention to issues of sexual or gender-based violence. Such issues have only rarely been addressed in ceasefire agreements or peace accords. Only 8% of the peace accords make reference to sexual violence as a war crime, and only 3 ceasefire agreements in Nuba Mountains, Burundi, and Lusaka have specifically included sexual violence as part of the definition of ceasefire. Despite limited roles at the peace tables, women nonetheless have found ways to advocate for political solutions to violent conflicts and to assure their agendas are heard. In the war we are living, we see women's roles in the quest for peace. They've been engaged in peacemaking for decades, and their work has laid the groundwork for today's peace talks. Because these roles are often invisible does not mean that women have not assumed high levels of responsibility for bringing peace to their communities and their country. Today, Colombian civil society, particularly women's organizations, are not at the table, nor for the most part are they demanding a place at the table itself. This does not mean they do not want a role in peace building. Currently, many groups under a new organization, the Women for Peace umbrella, are planning to mobilize to support the talks, to insist that the parties stay at the table until they end the conflict, so that they might participate in a discussion of the social agenda of the country. As we see in the war we are living, women like Francia Marquez and Clemencia Carabalí in Cauca are on the front lines of resistance to encroachment on their lands and fighting to prevent displacement of their communities. In Cauca and other parts of Colombia, women have dialogued directly with the armed groups to release hostages and to allow safe passage of food and medicine through armed blockades. They've developed innovative methodologies to create consensus across ethnic, class, regional, and religious borders. NGOs have had some success with campaigns to publicize sexual violence as a weapon of war and to advocate for laws that ban related practices. I'd like to turn finally to the question of gender in the conflict in Colombia. And I'd like to say a few words about gender dynamics and their relationship to building a sustainable peace. Understanding the multiple ways that gender impacts conflict dynamics in Colombia is key. Gender shapes each phase of conflict, from recruitment to displacement to engagement in armed groups to coping strategies during active conflict to peace processes to disarmament to demobilization and to reintegration and reconciliation. Participation of women in each of these phases of peacemaking and peacebuilding has been shown to produce better results and ensure that when peace comes, it will be more sustainable and its dividends will be shared by both men and women. In the Colombian case, there are particular reasons why women's engagement is critical. Sexual violence has been widely used as a weapon of war by all sides, as well as within every armed group. In addition, we've seen that domestic violence in communities often skyrockets when ex-combatants return home. Sensitivity to this issue will be important in the negotiation of any ceasefire or final agreement. Since mistreatment generally occurs against those who have faced historic social and economic discrimination, more equitable participation in peace processes and DDR programs will be important deterrents for continued abuse. Furthermore, since domestic and intrafamilial violence has been both a major reason why youth join armed groups and has been a primary cause of displacement of girls and their families, failing to address these issues all but guarantees that the cycle of violence will continue and ex-combatants will return to arms. Modeling roles for women in decision-making positions can be an important element of a violence prevention strategy. In another vein, if we consider that among the range of motivations female ex-combatants give for joining armed groups, young girls have noted that they found opportunities for leadership and responsibility in the insurgent groups that were denied to them in the broader Colombian society, where they found gender roles to be too restrictive. We see that strategies for integrating or reintegrating these girls and women will need to respond to the particular motivations that led to their engagement with armed actors. I should note here that given Colombia's long history of peace processes, male and female ex-combatants are an important untapped resource for the current peace process. Gender-sensitive approaches can also ensure that land reform agreements guarantee women equal access to land and land titles, as well as equal opportunities for credits, education, jobs, and other benefits. And I'll end here and leave it to Lorena Morales, my colleague at the Asociación Colectivo de Mujeres al Derecho, to pick up on the theme of land, which is actually the first item to be discussed on the peace agenda in Havana. Thank you.
Lorena, welcome to the panel.
Good afternoon for everyone. Thank you very much to Kathleen and Virginia for this important invitation to this panel. We have now the opportunity to share with you the experiences of Asociación Colectivo Mujeres al Derecho, which is an organization that works in the Caribbean region of Colombia, and in its 8 years of experience and work has dedicated its efforts to the work with women in relationship to their right to land. I'm going to refer to these items, and as you may understand, English is not my first language, so I am going to thank you if you have further questions for me to speak slowly, then I can understand you in English. Without discussion, as Virginia was telling in her intervention, armed conflict has a differential impact on the lives of women, and we can see that in both in quantitative and qualitative ways. So in our work, we have dedicated our efforts to see how these differential impacts affect women in their relation to land. And why do we do that? Because land in the struggles of the armed conflict in Colombia is in the middle, as it is as the control of land guarantees the armed actors the utilizations of natural resources and also the utilization of narcotraffic routes, which is the business through which armed actors of the Colombian conflict have got its main financial source. So who control the land may control natural resources and also can continue financing war. This is why the different manifestations of armed conflict against women, including sexual violence, have had as a main reason the control of land. Many of these violence that have perpetrated women have been perpetrated against them because it has been also a weapon to control lands and territories. Many sources in Colombia have stated that that one of the higher risk of women in the armed conflict is the risk of being here. Okay, thank you. One of women higher risk in the armed conflict in Colombia is the risk of being more easily dispossessed of their land, and this is due to different kind of reasons, according to what we have documented. One of the reasons is the historical discrimination that have been perpetrated against women and that have kept women away from the property of lands in Colombia. The other reasons has to do with the focuses or approach that the different public policies for accessing land have had in Colombia. These policies have focused on delivering or giving land to men and families instead of entitling lands on the head of women. Because of these reasons, women do not know much about regulations, about all the law that regulates the property, the tenants, and the use of lands. And during the conflict, as men are absent because they were dead or disappeared, women cannot resist the different way of dispossessions that were perpetrated and that are being perpetrated in Colombia. Because in the conflict, different ways were used for getting people out of their lands. Some of them were violent ways, threats, killings, massacres, homicides, but some of them were legal tricks for saying something. For example, fake purchase of lands, different manipulation of the titles of lands. So in these situations, women were not so aware to resist these kind of ways of dispossession that were perpetrated. This is recognized for many organisms, including our Constitutional Court in Colombia. What is the problem with this? Well, this is important to mention because there is also other reality. During the 60s and the 70s were movement of rural women that were fighting for land in Colombia. And these women in the 90s and at the end of the 80s got to be able to be owners of land because of the implementation of some policies that got to deliver land on the head of women, they got to be owners of land through the applications of these policies. So these were collective communities of Afro-descendant women, indigenous women, and peasant women who got organized and could access to land ownership. The problem with this is that these policies that were supposed to be affirmative actions for women, so through which they could access land, did not count with effective warranties and protection measurements. And during the armed conflict, these women, after they received their lands, they had to suffer the threats and attacks of the armed actors. Some of them got rid of their lands through those ways, and some of them also lost their lands because the state didn't protect effectively the land they delivered. I'm going to explain a little bit that situation. The state delivered this land to women and other peasants, and the state gave some subsidies but only the 70% of the cost of the land. The other 30% of the land had to be paid by the peasant women through some loans that they received from the agrarian banks of the state. These loans were supposed to be guaranteed by some other subsidies and actions that the state have to implement so these women could pay all the debts. But since the state didn't accomplish that, it didn't make any land adequation, any productive project delivery, these communities couldn't generate the economic dynamic that allowed them to pay these debts. And then they lost all these lands in some foreclosures because they were started judicial procedures in which the state charged all these debts. Also, all these loans were sold by the state agrarian entities to private financial entities that are also being charging these debts to women. So some of the women that through these policies got to be owners of land are now in displacement situation and are being charged huge debts that they cannot pay. Some of them are going to be restitute their land through the new policies that the state is going to be implementing, but they will have to pay the debts, even though through all these years they couldn't produce, they couldn't cultivate, they couldn't be in their lands. In this context, many women organizations, such as Colectivo Mujeres al Derecho, we have been working in the documentation of all these situations and have been trying to positionate all these demands in the international agenda. Since last year, we have been participating in front of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, in which we have been positioning the topic and in which last October, for the first time, it was implemented the first public audience on women issues regarding right to land in the Caribbean region of Colombia. Because before, it was spoken in the Inter-American Commission about land dispossession in Colombia, but not with the particular focus of women. We also have been positioning these items in the resolution that the CEDAW committee is going to take out about the implementation of CEDAW in the context of conflict and post-conflict. We have been participating in all the discussions that have been taking place in New York, in Sri Lanka, about these items, and we have made some inputs also to this committee. At the national level, we have been also participating in all the discussion that took place in the Congress, in which before the law of land restitution and reparation was taken out. We participated that and got to introduce some specific articles that protect women. For example, the creation of a specific program for the land restitutions to women. There must be the creation of a specific program to restitute land to women. Another specific article that was introduced was one about the condonation of the debts. There is an article now that says that all the lands that are going to be restituted have to be, and that has debts, these debts have to be condonated. And so on, there are other examples. But the problem now is that now that we are in the implementation and the regulation process of this new law, we are seeing that the issues of women are not being sufficiently considered. And now, for example, this program for the women land restitution has not been created yet, and there are some advances that the National Unit for Restitution is doing. There are some advances, but these advances keep the family focus of the prior national public policies. For example, this program is only trying to restitute lands to women that has the right on the land because of the relationship they may have with an absent
man that was the owner of the land. For example, they are trying to make more flexible proceedings in family law, in civil law, so that women can prove easily that they were the wife of someone, the daughter of someone, the sister of someone who owned land. But nothing is being considered for making more easy to women to claim for a restitution, considering that there are also historical problems for women being able to access to justice. For example, the problems related to Afro-descendant women, indigenous women that live in apart areas and they don't have enough economical resources to go to the capitals to claim for their rights. Also, the unknown or the workers of the public institutions are not prepared enough to face all the discrimination and are not prepared with a gender focus to attend all these issues related to women. And those aspects are not being considered in what the National Institution Unit is preparing for a women land restitution program. Another complex situation that has to do with women is that in Colombian context now, there are lots of threats, there are lots of risks for women working on land restitution items, such as the film that we saw now. These threats persist. Our organization is a short organization working mainly at local level because we do a lot of work in field and have been able to participate in these national and international spaces. But recently, from the first days of August until now, we have received more than 4 killing threats of an army that is supposed to be called the Anti-Restitution Army. And so there have been other threats all over the country. In the last 2 years, some organizations have registered 65 killings of land restitution leaders, both men and women. So it is a worrying situation, and the current law for restitution of land states that the protection programs have to be adequate to these risks. But the programs were supposed to be reorganized by a new legislation, but in fact, there is the same tramites and are the same protection measures, the ones that are being delivered. And these measures showed in the past to be non-effective, because if they had been so, we wouldn't have all these crimes against restitution leaders. There is a lot of trouble for women in the regions, in the local territory, to access to these protection measurements. The government is supposed to give precautionary measures to all the people claiming in land restitution processes. But the fact is that the organizations that are in the capital and that have some relationship with the governments are the ones that may have perhaps the opportunity of accessing these measurements. But for the leaders in the local and small territories, it is almost impossible to get these measurements. Only in 4 collective cases that we have documented in the past years, there were 20 murders, 4 massacres, and multiple kidnappings in the cases that we work. So currently, we are very in need of these protection measurements to be taken by the government, and we also need the programs for land restitution to be adequated. Another thing that is important to mention in relationship with the current dialogue for peace is that, as Virginia was saying, there is no representation of civil society at all in the dialogues, and that United Nations in the last weeks proposed some regional work tables in which civil society was building some proposals. But the fact is that these proposals are going to be taken to the dialogues through the senators, through the congressmen. there is not going to be representation of civil society, even though civil society is supposed to be building all these proposals in the tables. The ones that are going to be taking them to the dialogues are going to be the congressman. We also haven't seen that in the points of the agenda, there is no clear focus on how women and gender issues are going to be addressed, even though some of them or many of them are very important to have a gender focus that can correct all the discrimination that allow the dispossession against women and all the gender and women approach that is needed in the attention of the victims and the reparation and the land restitution in Colombia. I'm going to leave it there, and if you have further questions, then I can, of course, answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lorena. I'm going to ask you to turn off your microphone.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And we'll have time for questions and comments here, but we are also going to hear from Oriana Zill, who is the producer of this film. She's also the producer of investigative stories at CBS News 60 Minutes. She has been investigating all forms of issues around criminality, drug wars, gang wars, and I've asked her to now, in many ways, be a discussant to the other two panelists and to add her perspectives on what is a war that continues to go on every day.
Thank you so much. I hope you all enjoyed the film. I felt that I was very lucky to have the opportunity to spend some time with Francia and Clemencia in Colombia, and as always, I learned more from them than they learned from me, and I'm very glad that they were willing to share their stories. I think it is important that we understand that as we've talked about here, women in Colombia are in a high-risk position, but particularly when they start to organize and when they become leaders in their communities and become known as leaders in any of the complex battles that are going on politically to either get restitution for land lost or to get restitution for people who've died, things that have been stolen, any form of justice. Whenever there's women activists, they seem to be targeted. And in general, all activists, not just women, have been targeted. And there's not the sense, I mean, just coming from my perspective of looking at it as a journalist, you just don't get the sense that there's ever really an ability to get justice. For, you know, one of the things I like watching the film again today that really struck me was when you hear the line, well, you don't really know who the Águilas Negras are. And that really struck me when I was in Cauca with Francia and Clemencia, a few times they would say, oh, just like keep your head down and walk quickly, because they didn't want the people in some of the people in Cauca to know that I was there and I was filming them. And yet, you know, many of those people are probably the Águilas Negras who are living right next door to them, and they literally walk past them every day, and they know who they are. They actually do know who they are, but it's all done on this guise of, you know, well, we don't really know who it is, and there's no, you know, I mean, if you were here and that happened, you would call the cops immediately and get those people arrested, but it's not like that. And that's what struck me more than anything else, was that sense of insecurity and a lack of institutional justice. And so I think that's, to me, if I were living in that town, I think that's what I would work towards the most, is exactly what you're working towards, is trying to build the institutions that enable people to get justice for both the crimes and restitution for the crimes in the past. And another thing I was really struck by in Colombia is I did a lot of work when I was at PBS Frontline. I spent 3 years doing a series of 4 films about the war on drugs, and I spent a lot of time in Colombia looking at that. And so it was interesting to me when we were doing this film, the intersections that we found with both money laundering and obviously both the FARC and the paramilitaries in Colombia have funded themselves with drug trafficking. But there's also a lot of money laundering and intersection with drugs that have to do with gold as well. Gold and emeralds are both used as a way of laundering money. And when we were following the case of Hector Saria, we found there's a lot of people who sort of stand in for somebody else. So we don't actually think that Hector Saria is representing himself. He's representing some other actor. And I mean, I don't know the whole story. Obviously, the authorities have been investigating. But there's a lot of that where someone will stand in for somebody else in order to either launder money or to own land. And so it's all hidden. It's very difficult to get to the real bad actor. And there's all these schemes that I learned about when I was in Colombia to, let's say a group of people lost their land in a town. There's members of the criminal groups who will go in and claim that land as if they lost the land. And they'll come up with false documents that say, well, I'm the one who owned that land. And then there's, again, very local battles over a piece of land because someone is illegally claiming that they own it. The complexity of the schemes, the criminal schemes that were going on in Colombia really blew my mind. I mean, I'm someone who researches crime, and I just am constantly amazed by how clever, in a bad way, the money launderers are, the people who are trying to get land illegally, etc. It's very complicated, and it's extremely dangerous to fight them. So, of course, the women who are put in the middle of these situations are up against a big battle, and that's why I was so amazed and continue to be so impressed that they're still fighting. And that they continue every day to go and fight for, justice. So I do think that there's a lot of solutions and that there's a lot of steps that can be taken to improve the situation in Colombia and other conflict areas. And I think that one of the most important is something that Lema Gobi, who won the Nobel Peace Prize this year, I heard her speak at the United Nations recently, and she said, when you're dealing with what do we do to fix a situation, you should really always just go talk to the women in that town. And they'll tell you what needs to be done in that town. They'll say, okay, we need a new well, we need this, we need that, we need more education, And they'll make a list, and they'll tell you what they need, and they'll organize, implementing it. And that really did strike me, that we do need to get more women at the table saying what the needs are and what needs to be done, so that, There was a story in another one of the War We Were Living films about how when you're disarming the men, they were giving money for the guns. Men would come in and give their guns, and then they would get money in exchange for that. And obviously, we do that here in the United States too, when we try to take arms off the street. And one of the great things they started realizing was, don't give the money to the guy who's giving the gun. Give it to his mom. And then that money will go back and feed the family and da-da-da-da-da. Instead of just giving it to the guy who was the criminal. Give it to the mom. And it really is true that if we bring more women to the table, things will, it's not always perfect, but obviously it's going to, in some very important ways, get basic needs met. So,
thank you very much, Oriana. Well, I have a lot of questions, but I also know that there are people here in this audience, and so I want to open up the microphones. We have Nicoletta and Anne who will bring the microphone to you. I'd appreciate if you could introduce yourself and an organization if you represent one, and just show your interest in asking a question by raising your hand, and the microphone will find you. So if there are any questions, otherwise, okay, please. Anne's bringing, and if you wouldn't mind standing up, because we are on webcast and it does help our viewing audience.
Thank you.
Enjoy your question more.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Mapi Alvarez, and I crossed the border 27 years ago when I was 23 due to the violence in my region, Cartago Valle, Colombia, where a lot of women, thousands and thousands of women, have been killed by the mafia. And it's still going on. I went there in September, and it's still going on. My question for Ms. Jeannie, and thank you so much for putting this event, these talks. for me, Ginny, is what the academia is doing to help Colombia to bring justice, to put Alvaro Uribe on jail. I mean, he was in Georgetown, and Georgetown stand up and throw him out because he didn't deserve to be there. He was a chain for the university. So good for them. I have one for Lorena. ¿Cuántas personas hablan español, inglés aquí, entienden inglés? No. ¿Entienden inglés? Oh, que no entienden inglés, perdón. Que no. ¿Cuántas no entienden inglés? ¿Alguna? Okay. I just for them, I suggest that next time you have translators, interpreters for them. Lorena, there is a lot of talking, right? Mucho se habla aquí y allá. ¿Qué ha recibido concretamente el colectivo de mujeres de la Organización de Estados Americanos, donde yo sé que ustedes han ido a hablar? ¿Qué tipo de apoyo y qué tipo de protección les han dado? What are you guys and the colectivo de mujeres have received from the Organization of American States, where I know that they have been talking, and from any other government agency in the United States for protection and for support to them? And I have one for, Oriana. Thank you so much for doing such a beautiful and wonderful documentary. Where did you show your documentary? I remember that the first time that I saw it, you were saying that for protection of Francia and the other ones, it was not being like publicly put in YouTube or Facebook, things like that. So I want to know where it is, like right now, we can view it.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to take another question and then turn it back to our panelists. One question right here, please, if you could stand, introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Pari Farmani. I'm from the Institute for Inclusive Security, where we actually work to increase the participation of women in peace processes around the world. Of all of these countries, Colombia seems like a prime opportunity to include women in the peace processes going on right now, because it has more than 15 very active national networks of women. However, as we have heard, it is not the case. So I wanted to ask the women here and Lorena as a panelist what the international community can do and what the women need to be included in these talks. What can we do to pressure various governments to include women in these talks? And then one specific question regarding rural women in Colombia is, Lorena, do you see as control of land as a precursor to increasing the political participation of women in Colombia? Do you see land control as a requirement for, not requirement, as necessary to increase the political participation of women in Colombia? In rural Colombia, and not in the cities.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it back to the panelists, and maybe we'll begin with Oriana. If you could just give a little bit more background on the film as the question, and then we'll just go directly to Lorena and then to Jenny.
Sure. The film was produced for PBS, obviously, so for the for distribution inside the United States on public television, and it was distributed on public television, and then it was put up on the internet so that Americans could see it. And it was not, in general, when with films like this, the international access to the internet is not allowed for a variety of different reasons. One is because films are generally distributed. We have to fundraise to raise all the money for films, and so sometimes films, you get a small amount of money for selling them overseas. And there was an international distribution of this film, and I don't believe that it has aired in Colombia. And that was because, I think partially because Francia and Clemency were very worried that if it was aired in Colombia, that their lives would be at further risk. But I'm not positive whether it has. I think that it's possible that it has been distributed in other places in Latin America, but I don't know exactly. I can find out, though. I will.
You can open the link on the IP address from Colombia, because I did.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. For a while, you could not, and maybe that has changed. But when it was first up on the internet, you couldn't see it from Colombia. I know because people tried. But I don't know the whole history of what's happened since then. So it could. Did you do that while you were in Colombia?
Last week.
You were in Colombia?
Yeah.
Oh, well, so then I guess you can. Well, anyway,
Have we
that's
gotten
news
any,
to me.
I was just going to ask if we've gotten any tweets. I don't know if Steve's here or somebody's monitoring, but a number of people had tried and not been able to see it from Colombia that I contacted as well. So I don't
Right.
know, it may be regionally, different
know.
regions even.
Yeah.
All right, Lorena, thank you very much.
Thank you for your questions. First, I'm going to refer to your questions regarding land control and participation. I don't know if I understand clearly, but what I understand, if land restitution to women or women land control is necessary for their participation, is that? Yes, the answer is yes. The relationship in which women have not been able to control, to access to the use and tenants and property of the land have kept them relegated from the participation in daily life decisions in their families regarding their own life. So if the tenants, property and use of lands for women is ensured, they for sure are going to be able to participate more. And we need to guarantee that through a restitution process that includes their perspective and that has non-repetition warranties. So that non-repetition warranties means that women can access also to credits, to financial resources, to be able to use and to work and to remain in their lands, not being afraid of any other way, whatever it is, of dispossession, meaning armed or legal dispossession. So they need also to be educated in relationship to their right to land, to their property rights, to their patrimonial rights, and to their access to justice rights also. Also, we need to transform the institutions so they can be more sensitive to women issues. And only in that way we are going to ensure that women remain in their lands. Also, we need to justice to work. We need true, and we need, because if we don't know who the perpetrators of the displacement and the dispossession were, and if they are not judged, so non-repetition warranties are not going to be secured, and we are going to be at risk of new dispossession also. We also need to implement the condonation of the debts, because if not, women are going to be at risk of dispossession again if they are going to be charged all these huge debts again. So that's according to that, and that for sure is going to ensure their participation in public and private decisions. About what needs to be done for women participation in the dialogues, I think that one of the things that could be done is to support the initiatives of their own spaces of peace-building dialogues that are going to be built in the civil society and the groups of women specifically. I think that also we can send messages to the actors in the peace dialogues in order to convince them to include women in the negotiation tables, and showing them, of course, all the international framework that stands after all these rights that women have. But I think that it is also important to support the initiatives of dialogues that are being built in the civil society inside women's in local communities and groups. For answering Mapi's question about what kind of protection and support Colectivo has received, I had to sadly say that even though we have been seeking for precautionary measures in front of the Inter-American Commission since last year, and that these threats from August to now have been very reiterative and straight to the organization. We have not been able to accept any measure of protection inside of Colombia, and we have not been given any precautionary measures in front of the Inter-American Commission either. And this is very worrying because we are working in cases in which many political, economical power are involved, and if we do not have the warranties to continue our work in Colombia, more than 2,000 women are not going to be able to access justice. So it is very relevant for us to have the political and the practical measures that guarantee the exercise of our work. With political warranties, I mean judicial investigations of the perpetrator of these threats. We need impunity to finish, because if we continue with this impunity, the risks are going always to be there, and no material measures are going to work at all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Janine.
Thank you for your questions. I'll just address Mapi's first question about what the academia is doing to help bring justice to women. And I'm assuming you mean academia in Colombia rather than in the United States, or more, what is the U.S. doing? Well, you know, the U.S., I'm not as familiar with what U.S. academics are doing on gender justice in Colombia. My sense is there's not a huge amount of work going on this, either in the United States or in Colombia. And I think largely academics here take their lead from people who are doing research and documenting and producing the documentation on the ground. So it's a relatively new field in terms of segregating data and collecting systematic data about women separate from men. I think academics are somewhat dependent on systems of documents, in a sense, because they're looking for evidence of whatever it is that they're going to write about. I would say, though, and I'd like to mention, you know, the Center for Historical Memory, that was the Group for Historical Memory, is doing some phenomenal work. This is a group of about a dozen academics who are linked to Colombian universities, who were commissioned by the National Commission on Reparations and Reconciliation to produce a document or a series of documents that would explain the origins and causes of violence in Colombia. They have been at work for almost 8 years. They're about to release a final report coming up. They have already released about 20 books, and these are amazingly well-documented books about violence in particular areas, what they call emblematic cases. USIP funded some of this work on gender in particular, and there are 3 books that they've produced along with a number of other kind of ancillary documents, but they've done one book on the situation of indigenous Wayu women in La Guajira. They've done another book looking at Cauca and women in Putumayo, and a 3rd book on women in war on the Caribbean coastal area. These books, to my mind, although they are not, they have not been used yet to pursue justice in the courts, I think assemble the kind of documentation that will be needed to get gender justice in the future. Colombia is still a country in conflict. And that means that the capacity to achieve justice is somewhat limited by the context in which the crimes continue to be committed. So I have hope that down the road, gender justice will be forthcoming. And I think that there are some very valiant and courageous individuals and a few courageous institutions that are working to make this happen, but far fewer than I wish there were.
I'm going to open it up again for comments. Yes, please, sir.
I'm Christos Kirou. I'm from American University, and I'm also a research director at the Center for International Relations. I'm sorry, my bad. I thank you, ESIP, for having us again today in a marvelous event. I have 2 questions. One is film related, the other one is context related. There was a gentleman in the public event who said that, what are we going to do? Are we going to take the mountains and take weapons, or are we going to do this peacefully? And everybody cried peacefully, right? You see, as a negotiations expert, what I see there is that the rebels, in a way, the presence of the rebels adds leverage to these communities, in that they always have the option to take the mountains. So the question that I have is, if the negotiations go well, will there be any leverage left for these communities? Or are they going to depend on the 20% that the international community will give them, versus 50 and so on? The second question has to do with the role of women at war in general. There's been research in comparing wars that have to do with ideology versus wars that have to do with ethnicity and religion. And there is a pattern comparing Angola, Mozambique, the whole Cold War, Yugoslavia, and so on. There's a pattern emerging that wars relating to ideology always benefit women, in the short run at least. And usually when they end, women go back a few steps again. Wars that have to do with ethnicity and religion always hurt women, both in the short run and the long run. So here's the question that I have for Colombia. Once this ideological war is over, and you can call it narco war, whatever you like, but it's still ideological. Once it's over, are we going to drift into the discourse of ethnicity, minorities, and so on, that may actually take women back again? Or is it going to maintain its momentum as ideological as it is? So these are the questions.
I would you like to?
Sure. I mean, I can talk about the film part of it.
The film part, please.
I think that I found that moment in the film very interesting too, and mostly because when you're in any community, there's a tendency, obviously, whenever a conflict's going on that is so ideological, like the FARC versus the paramilitaries, oftentimes the people kind of get lost in the middle. I mean, whether they, you could argue forever about whether there should be more land reform or there should have been more land reform over this, the last 80 years in Colombia, so that the poor people wouldn't, join the FARC, et cetera. But I did find it interesting that that ever-present sort of like, what do you want us to do? Should we become rebels because you're taking away our land, or should we go to the city and be, literally homeless on the side of a mountain? Was something that I think that I think it's tragic in a way that the people are often, many of the paramilitary attacks in Colombia were justified because they said, well, we're killing the FARC, when oftentimes they were just killing the people who lived in that town. And they had nothing to do with the FARC. And actually this area, this region of Cauca, did have quite a lot of FARC activity while we were there. There was active fighting going on between the military and the FARC within 40 miles from where we are, but I never saw any evidence that any of the people we were dealing with had anything to do with the FARC or were even ideologically aligned with the FARC, because at this point, people are so tired of war that most people hate both the paramilitaries and the FARC, and just want them out of their lives. That was the overwhelming message that I saw everywhere I was. But it is, I don't actually think, I think it's very interesting. I think that the peace talks with the FARC at this point, I mean, in terms of their military might, and I'm not an expert, so I might be wrong about this, but it seems like militarily they're not that much of a threat at this point. So I'm not sure where the peace talks are really going to go, because what leverage do they have either? I mean, except becoming a political party and disarming. I'm not sure they have much leverage in these peace talks. They do? Well, that'd be interesting. I mean, I'd love to hear more about that, because I'm not an expert.
Excuse me, just to say that they do in that they may maintain the same situation forever.
low, yeah, low level conflict, yeah.
Jenny?
Yeah, I'd like to just add, I think nobody fully expects that the day after the peace accords are signed, violence in Colombia magically comes to an end. I mean, that would be, tremendously naive to think that that's the case. However, I think there is an expectation and a hope that a peace accord would create some mechanisms so that conflicts at the local level and at the national level can be resolved without violence. And these mechanisms have to be put in place, and people have to learn to use them. The first inclination is not necessarily going to be to call up the mayor's office, although I think we saw in the case of the film that Francia and Clemencia were very familiar with what the structures were that they should be using and could be using to get their particular situation resolved. So I think the peace accords hopefully would take away some of the armed violence that was going on, but would also create education mechanisms and try to shift a culture toward greater reliance on the mechanisms that are existing in a normal democratic society. Now that may take a while, and there are many places where those mechanisms have broken down, where the government has not been present, where the state has not had the capacity to address the grievances. And in fact, I think you could go back to the beginnings of the conflict and say one of the reasons so many people picked up arms in so many different guerrilla groups was that they had no vehicle to exercise their grievances in a nonviolent mechanism. So I think, the accords aren't going to magically resolve everything, but hopefully they would be able to set up some mechanisms that would allow people to find ways to resolve the problems at the local level.
Lorena, do you want to comment on the role of women ideologically or ethnic issues?
Thank you. I think that from my perspective, the war in Colombia for many, many, many years has not been an ideological war. It is obvious, according to the different interests of the actors, it is an economical war because the fight for the economical resources is in the middle of all the struggle. And the effective of justice is what is going to define the impacts that this war may have over Afro-descendant and indigenous people. And it has to do with the geographical ubication of these communities because they are in the middle of the natural resources. So if war gets to an end whenever, only the effective of justice is what is going to define that. And also is going to define if women go further or backwards, because we have some great legal frameworks. But the problem in Colombia have been implementation, have been that the state has lost lots of capacity at local levels, and that there is not enough political will to implement the advances of international laws and national laws, both at national and local levels. So only political will is what is going to define that at the end.
We have time for one last question. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Pilar Rivera. I'm from Colombia, and I have a question for Lorena. I would like to know in a few words, what do you think about the recently land restitutions that the government proposed, because there is a big debate in the social organizations and the government entities in my country.
And one last question. I'm sorry. This woman was waiting. Go ahead. Can you?
Okay. My name is Adeline Vargas. I'm from Tumaco in the Pacific Coast. But I have a question, but I prefer that Angie translate for better. You understand me, please? Okay. Mi pregunta es, bueno, ¿qué tipo de acciones desarrollan ustedes desde acá un poco para hacer como seguimiento o quizás apoyo en ver esa evolución, ese cambio hacia la mejora de la justicia, a que la justicia en Colombia hacia la mujer sea real? Porque en Tumaco, por ejemplo, trabajamos en una red de organizaciones, se llama Solimnar, y realmente la situación en Tumaco también es una situación de bastante violencia.
So Adeline's question is, what kind of actions or forms of support are todos tomando? Is everyone taking that can support justice in Colombia? And she's from Tumaco, and she's about to give an example. ¿Y vas a dar un ejemplo? ¿Me das el ejemplo completo para atrás? Okay.
Sí. Por ejemplo, el sistema de salud no se conecta perfectamente con el tema justicia. Todo lo que tiene que ver con violencia sexual no es bien llevado en los hospitales. Entonces, por eso, el manejo la ruta de acceso hacia la justicia que se debería llevar realmente no lleva a ningún fin, porque en los hospitales no necesariamente hay como las condiciones para poder hacer, digamos, el seguimiento al caso, digamos, la atención adecuada a los casos. Entonces eso es una de las evidencias, digamos, de que aún falta mucho para lograr que la justicia se implemente como debería, porque existen como esas falencias anexas al llevar la justicia.
If we want her to answer, we have to continue.
Sure.
Can you please?
So just really briefly, kind of a summary of that was healthcare is not often connected with local government. And because we have that failure in the system where hospitals don't communicate about problems with local police officers and et cetera, how can you connect that gap? How can you fix that breach?
We have just seriously 4 minutes left before our webcast ends, and I would like each of you just to very briefly, if you can address the questions or to make a summary remark. Go ahead, Lorraine.
For the question of the land restitution law, we as social and women organization think that it has many risks because it is a law that is designed to be implemented in a post-conflict situation, and in Colombia there is an ongoing conflict, and also there are lots of stress and attacks for people that is going to claim these restitution land processes. Also, it has some internal figures that are not going to allow a material restitution of the land, but just a formal restitution of the land, and it is not connected to measures that guarantee that people is going to be able to stay in those lands, because there is still armed actors, there is not enough protection, and also there is, for example, contracts in which people are going to be like receiving some rental for the perpetrators for saying so are the ones that are going to be exploiting and using their land. So there is not going to be true material restitution through these proceedings.
I'm not sure. You understand English, right? Or do you want translation? Okay. Because I could also speak it. Is there anyone who does not understand Spanish? Yes. Okay. Do you mind? I'm just going to speak in Spanish to facilitate a little bit, porque se explicó ya un poco del Instituto de Paz en inglés y creo que a lo mejor no habías captado en esta parte. Nuestra institución es una entidad financiada por el Congreso de los Estados Unidos y tiene un programa de financiación de proyectos en zonas de conflicto. Entonces es un programa que tiene un plazo anual, es una competencia global, pero se puede acceder información en inglés, desafortunadamente, en la página de web del instituto, es www.usip.org, y en esa página puedes encontrar referencias a todo el dinero que damos en todas partes. Tú puedes poner mujer, justicia y ver en otras partes y en Colombia qué tipo de actividades hemos apoyado respecto a cualquier tema que eliges poner, ¿no? De lo que sepa, en el caso de Colombia, no me acuerdo de ningún proyecto que enfoca en particular la justicia de género. Sin embargo, por ejemplo, ese proyecto del Centro de Memoria Histórica tenía un elemento sobre género que yo creo que es más de investigación que podría llevar a una justicia futura, pero no, y es también reparación simbólica en sí, tener ese tipo de documento, pero no es algo que es una actividad para llevar casos ante la justicia. Creo que hemos financiado proyectos así en otras partes, pero en Colombia, que yo sepa, no. Pero no quiere decir que uno no puede presentar casos así, ¿no? Entonces sería cuestión de conversar con gente del instituto para asegurar que el proyecto que estás pensando, si es que tienes un proyecto que quieres presentar, va dentro de los parámetros del mandato del instituto para contribuir a la prevención, gestión y resolución de conflictos.
Thank you, Jenny. And Oriana, I'd like you, if you could say a few wrap-up comments, and Lorena has one last thing she wants to say. We're at 4:30 and the webcast is over. I'm sorry. We can continue to talk afterwards.
No, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for seeing the film, and you can see the rest of the War We Are Living series online, and you can just search Women, War, and Peace, and it'll pop right up, and there's 5 wonderful films, so I encourage everybody to see them. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Oriana. And Lorena?
No, I just wanted 10 seconds to say that we brought some materials about the research and investigation in the Caribbean region that we have developed that can be taken. They are in Spanish. So, thank you.
And I want to officially end this part of the public event. Thank you for our viewers on webcast. And I would ask you all to join me in thanking our panelists who I think delivered unbelievably interesting and also, I will say, worrisome still, very worrisome. I'm trying to put an optimistic face on this, but we have a long ways to go. But it is clear that there are great efforts being made by women on behalf of women for all of Colombia. Thank you very much, each of you.